Hello again. This is Dr. Robert Guthrie, and we're continuing our Sunday school lessons from the Jerome United Methodist Church. For those of you who are in the class, you may remember that this is the weekend I was supposed to be taking the family on vacation to California. Needless to say, that trip was canceled some time ago. So to keep our schedule with the same schedule that you had from the beginning, I decided to insert a special class into this weekend. And that's one on the development of the Christian New Testament or the Christian Canon. It's an issue that most people know very little about. Even the scholars can't pin down exactly how it happened. But it's very different than what people thought. I remember growing up as a child, and you'll see it even in the movies like the Da Vinci Code. You thought that there was a large convention and people got together and voted to put certain books in and certain books out. That's not at all what happened. It was an evolutionary process, both in the Jewish scriptures and in the Christian scriptures. And they're, of course, correlated because they're both in our Bible. And why do you need to have this kind of canonical work? Well, canonical work is sacredly inspired text, to use Martin Luther's term. And therefore, it offers a consistent history of how the faith began, who Jesus was, what he lived, when he died, when he was resurrected, what his teachings were. We have a large number of his teachings. And after that, in the apostolic era, which was Peter and Paul and the other apostles, we have their writings to help guide us through the issues that were in their church and are in churches now. If you read Paul's letters carefully, you see that the churches were frequently at each other's throats, and he's trying to calm them down. So what this has done is gives us a consistent, fixed amount of literature where we can refer back to the basic teachings of Christianity, the basic teachings of the apostolic age, and understand how we deal with these issues, what we believe, and also a one set of writings that's used universally in the world. That the Bible teachings are the same here in North America, South America, Africa, Europe, Asia, whether it's translated into Korean or Japanese or Chinese or any of the African languages. It's the same Bible. So it's consistent, it's worldwide, it's unchanging. We have not added or subtracted books in the discussion since the 4th century. And it is the basis of our faith. Now, it's interesting that, as I said, this was an evolutionary process. Even when you go back to the Hebrew scriptures, that they're an evolutionary process also. That when we go to the Christian traditions, when Paul and his followers were quoting the Old Testament writings, the Hebrew sacred writings, they were actually quoting this. This is called the Septuagint. It's a translation into Greek, the common Greek of that era, which is about 200 BC. The common Greek of that era, because by that time, the Jewish diaspora, the spreading out of the Judean people from Palestine, had started, and they were scattered all over the Eastern Mediterranean. And in that context, most of them had forgotten how to read Hebrew or had never learned. So this book was translated about 200 BC, probably in the Alexandria, Egypt area, into the modern current Greek at that time. It's called Koine Greek. It's the common Greek of that era, not the classical Greek, which is 300 or 400 years before and based in Athens. Remember, a couple hundred years of language, how much it changes. How much has our language changed from Shakespeare's time until now. So that's the text that they were referring to, and that became the basis of the text for the early Christian church. This was a very commonly used text in the Jewish church also, in their own sacred writings. A lot of that was done from this Septuagint. It means the 70. The legend is that it was translated by 70 scholars in a limited amount of time. There's also 70 books in it. It does contain some of the books that are not in the classical Hebrew scriptures that have emerged much later. These are some relatively minor books: Judith, Tobit, Baruch, Wisdom of Solomon, a few books like that. The interesting thing about that is when the first Bible, the New Testament, was translated into Latin, which is called the Vulgate because it was written in the common Latin language of the western part of the empire about 380 AD, that St. Jerome, who translated that, used a lot of the Septuagint in addition to the Hebrew scriptures for his Old Testament, and he translated the Greek New Testament. Here's a copy of the Greek New Testament. I could have worse habits in collecting Bibles. And those are the two books that became the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, which was the official Bible of the Catholic Church for 1,000 years or so. So those are the reasons why you do it. In the Hebrew text, there were 4 different pathways that have led to the modern Hebrew scriptures. One, of course, was the Septuagint, which was a translation from Hebrew about 200 BC. The second one is what's called the Peshitta. The Peshitta, this is a copy of the New Testament Peshitta. The Peshitta is a translation into Syriac. Syriac is the Eastern dialect of Aramaic. Remember, there are many dialects to language. If you try to speak as an American to a South African, you use a lot of different words, even though you're speaking the same language. So those are different dialects, and Syriac is a dialect of Aramaic. Aramaic was the common language at Jesus' time. It was translated about 180 AD, and they translated the Old Testament using the Septuagint and the New Testament from the Greek into Syriac, and that has become the sacred text of the churches of the East, churches in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, and other eastern areas there. That still remains their text. There are modest textual differences between what's in the Syriac and what's in the Septuagint and other texts. There's a small community of Samaritans who have survived until this time, about 800 of them. They have their own sacred text, which is only the Torah, the first 5 books, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And it's written on a scroll. I've actually seen that scroll. They let me touch it, which I was a little bit shocked, but they did. And they say that this was written directly by Moses. I didn't point out to them, didn't want to be a jerk, that Hebrew wasn't a written language at the time that Moses was alive. But anyway, that's their sacred text, and it's slightly different also than the traditional Hebrew text or the Septuagint or the Peshitta. So those are the 3 ones, but the main one is called the Masoretic text, Masoretic, and this is the classic Hebrew text. It does not have all the books that the Septuagint has, and the oldest copies are from about 1000 AD. One of them is the Aleppo Codex, and a codex is a book. By the time they were having more voluminous writings, they had abandoned writing on scrolls, because the problem with the scroll is you could only write on one side of the writing material, which was often very valuable material. In a codex, you could write on both sides of the page and put it together in a book form. So by the time of early Christianity, books were coming more into fashion and scrolls were going out of fashion, as much for economy and ease of use from a book. So those 2 codices are the Aleppo Codex, which was written about 980 or 985, apparently in the Egyptian area, and it migrated over to Aleppo in Syria. It stayed in the synagogue there for centuries, and it was smuggled really into Israel in 1947. There was a lot of anti-Jewish rioting in Syria at the time of the creation of Israel, and they burned down the synagogue. It's only got about half of its text. The Torah part of it disappeared. Some people think the pages were filched by Israeli souvenir hunters as they smuggled it in. Nobody really knows. It's an interesting mystery question. But it's only half of the text. But the other one is called the Leningrad Codex, and it was written about 10 or 20 years later in 1008, also in the Cairo area, and eventually it was transmitted up into Russia with a large Jewish community there. And it was located in what was then St. Petersburg under the Tsar, and by 1924 it was placed in the Russian National Library, which was in what was then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg again. So it's called the Leningrad Codex. It is a complete Hebrew Old Testament excuse me here a second. And it is the basis of the texts that are used for the modern Hebrew Bible, and therefore the modern English Bibles that we use. And by the time that Luther was translating in the 16th century, he was aware of the existence of Jewish texts in Hebrew, and his translations of the Bible. He originally did the New Testament into German, but by this time the other translations were beginning to use that text rather than the Septuagint. So the Bible most Protestants use do not have those extra books that were included in the Septuagint, Judith and Tobit and Baruch and those things, which are now considered the Apocrypha. So that's the history of the Jewish text. Now, what happens, of course, why do you have to have a Christian text? Because and it's like we said before, you need to preserve the history of Jesus. You need to preserve the teachings of Jesus. You need to preserve the teachings of the apostles. And as the apostolic age ended, remember Peter and Paul were both martyred in Rome about 64 AD. Certain of the other apostles, maybe the apostle Jesus loved who wrote John, as we talked about last week, lived to maybe into the 90s AD. And that ended the apostolic age. And so as you got into the 2nd century, you had to have some way of preserving the faith and answering the questions of what does it mean to be a Christian. And so you began to look back at the writings, and you had to decide which of these you're going to collect, which of these are authoritative was the term, and which were not. And so you had a variety of scholars at the time, church leaders, who had a discussion in their writings about which ones to honor as authoritative. And the process is it's an interesting evolution. Again, it doesn't have a definitive starting point, and it does have a sort of an ending point. But all the books we now have in our New Testament had been written by about 120 AD. The last one is probably 2 Peter, written about 120. So as these discussions began to pop up, and the writers between 160 and 210 and even later, they knew what these books were. They had been floating around passed around in the Christian community. And so there was a discussion about various factors as to how you should decide what to include and what not to include. And there's some interesting characters that pop up in this, help this process. So it was a character named Marcion. In 144 AD, he goes into Rome and established himself as a Christian. There were actually 4 different Christian groups at Rome at the time. The traditional St. Peter's group, the Gnostic Christian group, which was a heretical offset, another heretical offset, and Marcion. Marcion said that Jesus had come not to support the Jewish literature, but to abolish or renounce them. So if he wasn't going to use the Jewish scriptures, which were used by the Christians at the time, because they all had the Septuagint, then he had to make his own decisions of what sacred text he was going to use. So he advocated using Paul's letters. Paul's letters, of course, had been written between about 48 AD and 64 AD, and they had been circulated in the Christian community ever since, so they were well known. So here is a person who really was outside the Christian veil, who helps the development of the New Testament, because he starts to discuss, hey, we need to have our own sacred texts, because he was rejecting the Jewish ones, which we do not. So we have to decide which ones we're going to include. He appears to have done like many people and cherry-picked things out of Paul's teachings and Luke's gospel that he liked that other people didn't like. So he was a controversial person in that. A few years later, there's a person named Montanus, and he said that he had been, as in the Gospel of John, imbued with the Holy Spirit. I know a lot of people who think they've been imbued with the Holy Spirit. I doubt that many of them are. So his followers, he had extensive followers, and they produced a lot of literature to defend his point of view. So that raises the second criteria. The first one was raised, we need to have some text. That was by Marcion. The second one is raised by Montanus. Wait a minute, we've got to be selective as to what text we consider authoritative. So these two movements, who were both outside Christianity, forced the church to begin to develop a criteria and a process, more than criteria, for deciding what texts are sacred and what aren't. So you find a process where you will ends up with somewhere between 22 and 27 books, depending on which approach you take to this. There were lots of other writings going on besides those ones. There's a Gospel of Hebrews, a Gospel of Peter, Gospel of Mary Magdalene, the Epistle of Barnabas, the literature like the Shepherd of Hermas, and the teaching or the Didache of the 12, and a wide variety of Acts of Peter and Acts of this and Acts of that. So you had a lot of writings floating around. So you begin to say, all right, how are we going to decide these? And what you find is that there is a self-fulfilling process that as orthodox or straight-thinking Christian thought begins to emerge in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, then those scholars, those leaders of the church will be attracted to the sacred literature that supports orthodox thinking. And so it becomes a mutual process where the orthodox thinking from the sacred writings helps the church develop sound sacred theology, and the emerging sacred theology shows them which books to make as sacred teaching. So it's an evolutionary process that they came together. You do find that the process evolved a lot more than you think. There really wasn't much debate by the mid-2nd century, 150 or so, about the 4 Gospels. There were other extra Gospels, but everybody knew the 4 original Gospels had been written in the previous century: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. There never was any real debate about them. A little bit of debate about John in the 120 to 140 range, but no real debate about those. Those were always accepted as canonical, and they kind of matched up. They were in the ancient world, there were 4 directions, there were 4 spirits, 4 directions of the wind, and so the 4 Gospels matched up nicely. You do find actually a fair amount of diversity if you look through the Gospels carefully. And there really wasn't much debate about Paul's letters. They were all considered canonical. There was some debate as to whether he wrote all of the letters. That debate goes on even now. Scholars will tear themselves apart trying to decide which of the letters he actually wrote and which he might not have written. And there's some debate about certain of them. But as you see this, by the 150s, Irenaeus, who was in Lyon, France, included Paul's letters, 1 Peter, 1 John. He included, along with the 4 Gospels, the Shepherd of Hermas, which didn't make it, and the Wisdom of Solomon, which didn't make it over the centuries. A few years later, in 215, Clement of Alexandria in Egypt had the 4 Gospels, the Epistles of Paul. He included Hebrews, James, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, and Jude, along with the Epistle of Barnabas. It didn't make it. And the Apocalypse, the Revelation of Peter, which also didn't make it. We have 1 revelation that's tough enough, but we don't have 2. The Library of Milan, later in Italy, again the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, Acts, Jude, 1st and 2nd John, but not 3rd, the Wisdom of Solomon, the Revelation of John, and the Revelation of Peter. Origen, who was the great Egyptian Christian scholar, coined the term New Testament. That's an interesting thing. This is and later in the 3rd century. He used the 4 Gospels, Paul's letters, Hebrews, 1 Peter, 1 John, and the Revelation of John. But absent on his list were 2nd and 3rd John and 2nd Peter. He knew of them, but he really didn't think they were authentic. This sits there through the 3rd century, the 200s, and it kind of coalesces after 325. 325, of course, is the great history thing in the history of Christianity, the Council of Nicaea, the first great council, and the chair of that was a man named Eusebius, who was the Archbishop of Constantinople and the personal bishop to Emperor Constantine. Emperor Constantine, of course, was the first Christian emperor. A very interesting man. I personally believe he was a true Christian. He was also a warlord. As to be the emperor, he had to be a warlord too. So it's an interesting contrast. But Eusebius chaired the Council of Nicaea, and after the Council of Nicaea, he had a list. I've got a copy of his book downstairs. He had a list of things that were authoritative for sure. The 4 Gospels, 13 Paul letters, Acts of the Apostles, Hebrews, 1 John, 1 Peter, and Revelation. Disputed, his second category, was James, Jude, 2 Peter, 2nd and 3rd John, Hebrews, and Revelation. Revelation's in 2 categories there. And ones he thought that were not, that were spurious, that were not truly apostolic, the Acts of Paul, the Shepherd of Hermas, Revelation of Peter, the Epistle of Barnabas, Institution of the Apostle, that's the Didache, we've talked about that. Revelation again, along with the Gospels of Peter and Thomas. So that was his criteria. It's interesting that right after the council, reports have emerged recently in digging through the literature that there's some instruction from Constantine to Eusebius, why don't you make up 25 Bibles and I'll pay for it. Constantine was a strong ruler. If he told you to do it, you said, yes, your majesty, and you did it. So there really wasn't any more discussion about the list of the sacred books after 325 until there was a final list in 367 by Athanasius, who was the Bishop of Alexandria, and he named the 27 books of the canon. They included all of Eusebius's authentic and disputed books, while he rejected the others. So my impression, this is an impression, is it really was settled by Eusebius himself after the Council of Nicaea when he came up with his list. And then the king told him, make up some Bibles, and he said, yes, sir, and you did it. So the criteria that had emerged in looking at this was you had to know that these were written a long time ago. So you would look back at the writers of the 2nd century who would refer, they knew about the 4 Gospels, they knew about Paul's letters, they knew about the other letters, which are called the letters to all Christians, James and Hebrews and 1 Peter and 2 Peter. So you look back in the records, you see that they knew about them, that those ancient scholars quoted them and regarded them as authentic. They had to claim apostolic origin, which is a bit problematic because they all did that, even though clearly the apostles weren't alive for all of these letters. And it's actually, when you look at that criteria, it's the content of the writings more than the claim of apostolic origin, which cements them into being part of the New Testament. You had those 2 forces emerging, like I said earlier. You had the emergence of Orthodox belief, which was codified at the Council of Nicaea in 325. Jesus was fully human and fully God with a mystical union of the two. That, and that salvation is through faith in Jesus alone, and that these are Jesus' teachings, these are Paul's teachings, and that's the emerging orthodoxy, and the text had to link into the emerging orthodoxy. So there was a symbiosis, a merger of these 2 emerging forces, which brought these together to create the Christian canon, which we have used now since 325 or 367. All these centuries later, it remains our staple. Everything we believe is in there, and what we don't believe isn't in there. And like I said, this is the same Bible we use worldwide. So it's a very interesting process, but it's not exactly what you think, but it's God's working his will in mysterious ways to develop these 2 forces together, Orthodox thought and the Orthodox biblical literature coming together to create the New Testament. So this is Dr. Robert Guthrie. It's been a pleasure to speak to you all again.